Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're venturing into something pretty fascinating. What's actually happening inside our brains during sexual pleasure and, well, orgasm.
Yeah, it's more than just the plumbing, so to speak.
Exactly. We're not just doing basic biology here. We want to unpack the neurological side of it all.
Right.
We've got some scientific articles guiding us.
Right. And maybe a good way to start to show how complex this is the case of Marian.
Ah, yes. Tell us about her.
Well, she was in a study testing a testosterone patch. The idea was, would it boost libido in women?
Okay.
So after 3 months, she reports everything's improved, more desire, more erotic feelings. She even had an orgasm for the first time in ages.
So you'd think, okay, the testosterone worked.
You would absolutely think that. But here's the kicker. She was in the placebo group.
No testosterone at all.
None. Zero. Which just perfectly illustrates that sexual desire isn't just hormones. It's this whole mix of psychology, environment.
All happening in the brain and nervous system.
Precisely. So that's our mission for this deep dive. Explore those key neurological pathways for desire and orgasm, men and women, based on the science.
Okay, let's start with desire then. Marian's story really drives home that mind-body thing.
It does. I mean, just being in the study, the focus, the talks about sexuality, that alone probably played a huge role for her.
Right. It makes you think about other triggers, like visual stimuli. We know that's powerful for men.
And for women, too, potentially in ways we didn't fully appreciate. There was that 2007 study, Meredith Chivers and her team.
Oh, yeah. That one caused a bit of a stir, didn't it?
It did. They looked at how different erotic films affected arousal in heterosexual and gay men and women.
And the finding for heterosexual women was unexpected.
Kind of, yeah. Their genital arousal seemed to ramp up with the intensity of the sex on screen, almost regardless of who was involved.
Regardless, like...
Men, women, even bonobos, famously.
Wow. Okay. And that was different for the men in the study.
Yeah. Heterosexual men tended to be much more specific to, the gender they're attracted to. Gay women were also an exception. Didn't show that same pattern as the straight women.
So it adds this layer. It's not just about emotional connection driving female desire, though that's obviously important.
Exactly. It points to the strong physiological response to visual cues, sort of independent of the specifics for straight women in that study.
And how does this fit into models of sexual response? I'm thinking of Helen Singer Kaplan.
Right. Kaplan's big contribution was adding desire as that first crucial psychological step. She really highlighted how things like anxiety or inhibitions can just shut that desire down.
Yeah, the mental roadblocks.
And then you have Rosemary Basson, who came along with a different view, more of a circular model.
That one feels quite intuitive, I think. The idea that desire doesn't have to come first.
Exactly. Basson suggested it can be sparked by arousal itself, by genital stimulation. And importantly, her model doesn't put orgasm as the be-all and end-all.
Right, satisfaction can happen elsewhere in the cycle. It's not always this linear climb to the top.
Which brings us nicely to orgasm itself. How do we even, define it scientifically? Kinsey talked about it mostly in physical terms.
Just the bodily response.
Pretty much. But then you have researchers like Barry Komisaruk and his colleagues arguing it's way more complex. Sensory input, yeah, but also cognitive stuff, emotional forces.
All tangled together.
And Kent Berridge had this interesting idea of pleasure as a kind of gloss.
A gloss.
Yeah, like the limbic system, the brain's emotional core paints this layer of pleasure onto the basic physical sensations.
So the brain itself is adding the good feeling part, not just registering it.
That's the idea. And if you think evolutionarily, maybe this differs between sexes. For men, orgasm and ejaculation are obviously tied directly to reproduction.
Clear biological purpose.
Right. For women, it's less direct. Maybe it helps sperm retention. Maybe it's about social bonding. The why is deworded.
And that difference could mean different brain wiring is involved.
Could be. Which is why looking at brain activity is so fascinating. Let's look at men first. Gert Holstage did some key PE scan work.
PT scans.
Yeah.
So watching the brain in action during ejaculation.
Exactly. And the results were, quite something.
What did they find?
Huge activation in the ventral tegmental area at the VTA.
Which is part of the reward system.
A major part. And the level of activation, Holstage compared it to the effect of injecting heroin.
Wow. Okay, so evolutionarily that makes sense. Reproduction needs to be highly rewarded.
Extremely. They also saw activity in areas linked to memory-related imagery, visual processing.
Why that?
The thinking was maybe the men were using visualization, mental imagery to help things along.
Ah, okay. Anything else light up?
The anterior cerebellum was active too. We usually think of the cerebellum for motor control, but it's also involved in emotion. So maybe it's coordinating the emotional side with the physical actions.
Interesting. And what about areas that calm down?
Good question. The amygdala showed decreased activity.
The fear and vigilance center.
Yep.
It's like the brain saying, okay, stand down, no threat here, everything's good, sort of letting go of alertness.
Okay, so that's the male picture from Holstage's work. What about women? He studied them too, right?
He did. Same PT scan approach, this time during orgasm achieved through clitoral stimulation.
And did they see similar things? Or different?
Well, some expected things first. Activation in the sensory cortex, the area processing touch from the clitoris. That makes total sense.
Obviously. But there was a surprise.
A big one. Instead of just lighting up everywhere, large parts of the brain actually showed decreased activity during the female orgasm.
Decrease. That seems counterintuitive. Where?
Notably, the left lateral orbitofrontal cortex. That area is thought to be involved in sort of rational control over desires and impulses.
So shutting down might be that feeling of letting go, losing control.
That's one interpretation, yeah. Releasing inhibitions. Also, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex quieted down.
And that's linked to things like moral reasoning, self-consciousness. So maybe a temporary suspension of that self-monitoring, that judgment.
Huh. And the amygdala? Did that decrease too, like in men?
It did, yes. And Holstage noted it was generally an even more pronounced decrease in women.
What would that be?
His take was that feeling safe, avoiding fear and anxiety is absolutely crucial for women to reach orgasm. So really dialing down the vigilance center is key.
Okay, this deactivation picture is interesting, but Holstage also made a somewhat controversial statement about emotion, didn't he?
He did. Based on these deactivations, particularly in prefrontal areas, he suggested that women don't actually experience emotional feelings at the moment of orgasm.
That sounds debatable.
Yeah.
Does other research agree?
Well, no, not entirely. And this is where Komisaruk, Whipple, and their team come in with a different perspective.
What did they do differently?
They cited women who had complete spinal cord injuries below the level of injury but could still achieve orgasm.
Oh, without the usual nerve pathways.
Through vaginal and cervical self-stimulation. They describe these as deep orgasms, not originating from the clitoris, potentially using alternative pathways like the vagus nerve.
Okay, and what did their brain scans show? Contrast with Holstage.
A big contrast. Instead of widespread deactivation, they found general activation across the limbic system, the brain's emotional heartland.
So the emotion centers were lighting up.
Exactly. They saw activation in the amygdala, interestingly.
Opposite of Holstage.
Right. And the hypothalamus, which releases oxytocin.
The love hormone involved in bonding.
Plus the nucleus accumbens, key for reward. And, fascinatingly, activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula.
And why are those significant?
Because another researcher, Helen Fisher, has linked activity in those specific regions to the later, deeper stages of romantic love and attachment.
So this suggests a potential neurological link between this type of orgasm and feelings of bonding or love.
It certainly points that way for these specific orgasms they studied. It really highlights that female orgasm might not be just one single phenomenon in the brain. There could be different types with different neural signatures.
That makes a lot more sense, considering the variety of experiences people report.
Absolutely.
So wrapping our heads around all this, what are the implications? Understanding this brain activity must be useful, right?
Hugely useful, potentially. Especially for helping with sexual problems. Think back to Marian.
Right. It wasn't just about giving her a hormone. It was more complex.
Exactly. It involves brain patterns, psychology. This is why sex therapies often work on changing thought patterns and associations around sex. They're directly targeting these neurological processes.
And are there drugs being developed based on this brain science?
There are attempts. Bremelanotide is one experimental drug you might hear about. It doesn't target hormones, it targets receptors in the nervous system involved in regulating drives, like hunger and sex.
Trying to boost desire via brain chemistry.
Kind of. It aims to block certain receptors that might normally put the brakes on desire. It showed some promise for arousal.
But there's always a but with experimental drugs.
Well, yeah. The FDA had concerns about side effects like nausea and blood pressure changes. It just reminds you how tricky it is to tweak these complex brain systems without causing unwanted effects elsewhere.
It's definitely not simple, which, makes you wonder as we understand more and more scientifically.
Does it change the experience?
Yeah. Does analyzing something so intimate, so spontaneous maybe take away some of the magic? Or does understanding enhance it? It's a weird balance.
It's a really interesting question. So I guess to sum up our deep dive today,
Go for it.
sexual desire, sexual pleasure, orgasm, they're incredibly complex neurological events. It's not just biology 101.
Definitely not.
It's this amazing dance between hormones, yes, but also sensory input, reward circuits, emotion centers, memory, inhibition, control, all orchestrated in the brain.
And with real nuances between individuals and maybe even different types of orgasm, particularly for women.
Exactly. It's far richer and more varied than simple models suggest.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. Given this intricate ballet of brain regions we've talked about, does understanding the why behind orgasm change how you perceive the what? Does knowing the neuroscience shift your view of the experience itself?
Something to think about.
Definitely. Until our next deep dive, keep those connections firing.